There are pockets in our global community that are choosing to overcome passive acceptance with collective action. We're seeing that out on the streets. Who are those humanitarians? How are they embracing and internalizing what it means to be a humanitarian? And what can humanitarian organizations learn from what we're seeing out on the streets, in the flotillas, in grassroots societies? I think there's absolutely something to look into there.
Welcome to Rethinking Humanitarianism, a show that explores the future of aid in a world of rising crisis. I'm Levi Sharpe, the producer of this show. As our first episode of 2026, I'll be chatting with our show's regular host, CEO of the New Humanitarian, Tammam Aloudat. Last year, we talked about everything from the UN's pivot point, or the crisis of liberalism, to the aid sector's blind spots, to Trump's plans for Gaza, to the failure of international laws. Our guests have taken on incredibly difficult topics, but they've also come up with ideas on how to move forward. Small steps that might lead to change. So in this episode, we're going to share what we've learned, as well as take a look forward at 2026. If you have any questions or comments, stick around for the credits to find out how to reach us at Rethinking Humanitarianism. Tammam, thank you for joining us on your show.
Thank you.
So we covered a wide range of topics in our episodes in the past 6 months. And one thing that was pretty clear early on is that across the myriad of subjects, there were certain patterns in terms of issues guests identified that are ailing the aid sector. And I'm going to lump these into the categories of the rise of illiberalism, opaque systems, messaging, and aid cuts. So first, the big bugbear of illiberalism. Can you describe some of the ways it's reared its ugly head in our topics and some of the constructive takeaways our guests offered?
I think it is a good way to start rather than from where most of the conversations are starting now. We're talking about the aid cuts before we talk about anything else in most fora in the humanitarian sector. And I think it is the most painful symptom, and I emphasize symptom, of the current situation. What was perceived as a world liberal order after the Second World War, with all its diseases, has gone away. And to reiterate it, it used to be liberalism is the idea of democracy, the idea of individual rights, the idea of sovereignty of states under international institutions, but also the idea of open markets. I don't think the open markets is necessarily a recipe that benefited the poorer people in the world before, but at least there was also a Keynesian economics which gave birth to the welfare state, which refused to let the weakest people in society just suffer needlessly. Mm-hmm. All that seems to have gone away. And I think we've explored that in multiple ways. In the episode about the UN, for example, and on Uthant, the Secretary General of the UN, it was actually quite revealing that in the 60s, there was much more space for politics and negotiation done by the UN itself.
Yeah.
Another symptom now is that the UN isn't necessarily able to practice an active political role in the conflicts and crises that we're having. I mean, I remember a line from one of our episodes about the rise of liberalism. Anjali said something to the effect of, states don't believe that the lives of people who elected them actually have value or matter.
It's instructive to think about whether or not governments care that their citizens die. Because we have good evidence that some governments do not. The US government does not care if Americans die. It is a murder regime in that way. It is an actively pro-death government. So we shouldn't be surprised when that casts out to the global scale also.
We are talking about cuts to the aid system that are causing lives here and now. PEPFAR, the president's program on HIV treatment that has started under George W. Bush in 2004, has been cut. Thousands of people are contracting HIV now because of the cuts, and many are dying. The cuts to USAID, the modeling by The Lancet, which is a very famous medical journal, has put the cost in life at nearly 14 million by 2013, 5 years. And international law, as we've discussed in a recent episode, has become so profoundly broken that a televised genocide is possible with the almost unanimous support of Western countries. We've talked to Saskia Brechenmacher, who told us about the retreat of the idea of gender equality and its application, and how that is affecting women and LGBTQ plus people. It's getting worse. The soft politics, the soft power, the we are in this together. Yes, you're poor, I'm rich, but we're still in this together and we'll help each other, has all but disappeared.
What would you say are some of the big constructive takeaways of what people said about this issue in our episodes that stuck out to you and gave you some kind of hope?
I think people are more willing to speak up. In the episode on Palestine, people have spoken up about what's happening. In the people on the episode on the UN, there's a recognition that the system is not really functioning. In the episode with Hourie on the UNHCR,
aid should be delivered, but also should be delivered for a specific period of time. We cannot deliver aid and relief for 20, 30 years in camps. This should not be the situation. We're not going to question if aid should be delivered. We're going to question how long the aid would be delivered and by whom.
We're starting to pinpoint those problems loudly, and that is important, I think. Now, to my mind, what all this tells me, there is an existential question for the humanitarian sector, at least the formal one, what is now being called in the literature Western humanitarianism, is we cannot potentially be comfortable in this compromise with the liberal West anymore. The compromise was we pretend to not be political and you pretend to want to help others. And that gives us enough space to save lives, at least at a basic level. We have some resources, we have some space. The disappearance or the retreat of liberalism diminishes that space, forecloses the possibility of the humanitarian sector actually functioning in a way that justifies this, apolitical compromise. So I think it is time, and now not out of luxury, but out of necessity, where we have to consider what is the political role of the humanitarian sector in being able to provide humanitarian aid, but also preventing the state of illiberal and potentially dangerously far-right and fascist tendencies in Europe from actually harming not only people who are already harmed, but also people who think now that they are safe.
The episode with Saskia really comes to mind when thinking about constructive takeaways, because she wrote such a brilliant paper. And one that comes to mind right now, funnily enough, is actually taking a page out of the book of some of these far-right organizations, which have become more connected, even transnationally.
First of all, the resistance has grown quite a bit. It's become more transnationally connected. So what were previously disparate movements, disparate ideas in different regions, they've come together in a more unified manner and is using kind of similar language, similar discourse, similar strategies. And also kind of the scope of the resistance has broadened. So it's no longer just about abortion, for example. When it comes to this topic right now, it's so black and white. It's so dominated by disinformation and by sort of these hyperpolarized narratives of what the other side is or what they want or what we want. So I think just actually having more real world conversation about these issues can be really effective because it makes it clear that actually in reality, most people's views aren't as black and white. They're more nuanced and they're more complicated and they're more informed by personal stories and their own experiences of gender than we maybe suspect.
Progressive organizations aren't doing that as well.
At least not in the humanitarian sector. No, we aren't. We're in a resource competitive, because we have reached a stage where if you get money, I don't get any. we're not a movement anymore. We're institutions, and institutions need resources to support the bureaucracy. And in that sense, we need to retreat from that.
Mm-hmm.
Progressive forces have failed systematically at appealing to the masses, at actually identifying, saying something that people who are the target of it are able to identify with. If you look at it from a political perspective, most of the humanitarian sector leans towards the center right rather than a progressive force, leans towards being conservative, accepting the status quo, and so on. If humanitarianism, in my view, doesn't manage to regain its spirit of being a movement towards aiding people, and let's face it, it's not apolitical, at least not all of it. Eleanor Davy talks in her history of the early years of MSF about how the sans frontierism emerged from at least the disappointment of the failure of the 1968 student rebellion in France. It has historically political roots. When here, I'm not talking about necessarily about politics with a capital P. I'm not talking about slogans and pamphlets and so on. I'm talking about like what our space did in bringing together the candidates for UNHCR Commissioner General, which was now selected. It's Barham Saleh, the ex-president of Iraq. At the time, there were several candidates. I mean, it was very clear this is not a democratic process. This is a decision by the UN Secretary General. And they played it as if they are campaigning. They aren't. But they were forced to give policy statements. They had to speak to refugee-led organizations that are some of their constituency if they take the position. And they had to answer questions. Not all of them did it great, but I mean, maybe the appearance of a democratic process pushes towards it. And this is a political act. This is not just like a technical, give us answers to this set of questions. This is creating the political theater. You have others to answer to than the person that will give you the job. And I think it's important, even if it's still imperfect. And I think what our space and other refugee-led organizations, as Hourie explained to us, did was incredibly potent. They've created the appearance of democracy, hence showing the necessity of democracy in a circumstance like this.
Yeah. Early on, I would just cringe and chuckle at the performance of it all. And it is funny that real good can come from that, or at least if we want to call political theater an art, it sort of becomes life imitating art. And in that way, we sort of start moving not to, I would say, the ideal of where we should be, but at least a direction towards something that kind of looks like that a little more, which is better than nothing.
I think there is a ritualistic aspect to any public endeavor. That's politics. There is a performative aspect, and it doesn't need to be bad. I'll give you an example. When racism or sexism becomes unacceptable, it doesn't mean that everybody in society suddenly became equitable and unracist and lovely. But it means they have to perform that because it's not okay anymore to use certain words or do certain acts or so on. That's a good thing because it reduces our exposure. It denormalizes the racism and sexism to the extent that we would sit and watch TV, something like Mad Men, which shows how in recent years, like not too far into the past, rampant sexism in the workplace was absolutely okay and normal.
Why aren't you in the brassiere business?
Excuse me?
You should be in the bra business. You're a work of art.
So, in a way, the performance is a kind of how do we as a community choose to act up this? There are performances that are important to maintain.
In concluding this category of illiberalism, I too want to play another quote that Anjali Dayal said, which I think was at least the most optimistic takeaway we could have in such a thorny and dystopian topic. And she said,
I actually don't think that we are only stuck between bad and worse, because this is a period of contestation. A period of contestation is a dangerous one, certainly, but it is not one in which the inevitable outcome is going to be worse than the situation that we're in now. Now, the problem with talking like this is that people along the way will be deeply hurt, die. Not all of us will make it out the other side. You talked about 14 million excess deaths from the failure of the US to sustain its aid, right? From shutting down of programs like PEPFAR. That's, in any case, a bad situation. But I do think it's important for us to see that there are people at every level of these systems who are motivated by the desire for human flourishing.
One of my political thinkers of choice is Antonio Gramsci, and he talked out of prison of Mussolini in the 1930s, wrote the prison notebooks. One of the famous quotes that are brought from him is that the old is dead and the new hasn't been born. And a lot of people quote it like this, but the quote continued, says, this is a time of monsters. And it feels prophetically true now. I'm not the optimistic kind normally, but what Anjali brought up, not from an empty optimism point of view, but from a realistic, if we don't know the possibilities and where we stand, there's nothing to be done. And there is definitely much to be done.
I will say, though, as somebody who loves to play Dungeons and Dragons, you'd think I would love to be living in a world of monsters. But I gotta say, it's not all it's cracked up to be. So the next issue that came up a lot in our episodes was the opaqueness in a lot of our systems. And as we already discussed, this ranges from how UN leadership posts are chosen, such as the Secretary General and refugee chief, to also the kind of horse trading that can go on in major conferences, such as COP. Can you talk about this and what we were able to learn from our guests?
I mean, there has been a lot of coverage and discussion about this opaqueness of the UN system, but also political systems. And I think Erwin, our colleague who does the policy analysis and writes Inklings newsletter, has covered it repeatedly. It's not hard to point out. UN OCHA's chief has always been a British. The WFP is now Cindy McCain, who is American. UNICEF is always an American. I think IMF is always French. And I think this feudalism is distressing in this day and age, especially by the countries that are advocating democracy and freedom of expression and of being to the rest of us. When I had the interview with the humanitarian chief of the UN, Tom Fletcher, I asked him about that. Do you think it's appropriate that you are yet another, I think the fifth white and the sixth British chief of OCHA? And he said, it was a vigorous selection process. And I have no doubt of that. I don't doubt his capacity. But the field of candidates was limited. And he said, I wish that this wouldn't be the case afterwards. And I do wish that too. But this is a practice that is normalized. Now, I don't want by any means to pretend that this is unique to the UN. And I'll talk, for example, about the opaqueness of the EU. When I accompanied the Samud flotilla, which was carrying activists and humanitarian aid to Gaza, part of the way, one of the people on the boat was an Irish member of parliament, and she was telling me about the politics of the EU. For example, Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, has stated unequivocally the EU's support to Israel on multiple occasions. And guess what? She doesn't get to do that. The EU foreign policy is not subordinated to the president. She is breaking her own EU law by doing this. This is a consensus position of all EU countries, and the foreign chief of the EU is not subordinated to the president. But when you are a normal person listening to the news, you'll think that this is the EU position. That is such a horrible feature of politics now. But there is an increased demand for transparency. And there's a recognition of this opaqueness is not disputed anymore. It's either becoming blatant lies or unequivocally harmful. If you go to the UK, there are 6 people, if I remember right, who are on hunger strike because they are in prison, because they've been accused of being terrorists, because they carried a sign in a protest that supports Palestine action. And members of parliament were pressuring the deputy prime minister, David Lammy, to just talk to them about it. And he refused so far. This will not stand. It cannot stand. People cannot be pressured into, you'll have to live under us, practicing authoritarianism and calling ourselves democracy forever. People know what democracy should look like, and I doubt that they will survive it. And it's not only about citizens. In humanitarianism, you have a second-degree problem. Arguably, all governments are paternalistic. And a Ministry of Health saying you have to vaccinate or you have to wear masks is a paternalistic act by definition. What he differentiates is, in normal politics, in a liberal democracy, you might not like what they impose on you, but you have a resort to an election that overthrows them if they do it. If you are a recipient of humanitarian aid, the paternalism continues, actually gets amplified because the paternalism of the donor government and then the paternalism of the humanitarian provider, but there's no resort for people. So this is an incredibly harmful and oppressive paternalism that we recognize and we talk about not doing, but we continue to do. The system continues to accept earmarked money, continues to disproportionately succumb to donor pressures and requests, and continues to tell people what is best for them, which is, I mean, I wouldn't want someone to tell me what's best for me and my family and my community without even asking us. But we find it normal that because we're giving them money, we have to tell them who lives and who dies. We prioritize without asking, and we cut aid and leave them be and sometimes die without having their opinion involved. This cannot stand. There will be a breaking point where this negligence and oppression in a day and age where people have access to information is not going to be sustainable.
Yeah. You know, in this time of monsters, I think people are paying more attention to the systems that manipulate how their lives are going to be. There are these memes that have been popping up for a long while now. They're very US-centric memes, but they do speak to what we're talking about here. People will post something along the lines of, oh, you know things are really bad when everybody knows the name of the US chief of staff.
Yes.
Famously, I think Americans have been very politically ignorant. But when things are bad, yes, people do pay attention. And when they pay attention, they get upset, rightly so. And when they get upset, hopefully they start tearing down the opaqueness of the systems. They figure out how it works, and they want to change it.
I mean, in the episode where we talked about the image problem, Sana from MSF Canada told us that civil society having to remind leaders or people with power of what humanitarians are and what does it mean to have humanitarians.
I think that's an interesting harkening back to who is a humanitarian and how are we redefining that today? When you say, why aren't we taking action? We are witnessing, as we've said, there are pockets in our global community that are choosing to overcome passive acceptance with collective action. We're seeing that out on the streets. Who are those humanitarians? How are they embracing and internalizing what it means to be a humanitarian? And what can humanitarian organizations learn from what we're seeing out on the streets, in the flotillas, in grassroots societies? I think there's absolutely something to look into there.
I think this is a political role to go speak to people, shame them, point it out, public and private, whatever works, and remind them what does it mean that people are dying, that people are suffering, and they are not suffering accidentally. They are suffering by the actions of those same leaders. I mean, most of Western countries still sell weapons to the UAE, which is supporting RSF in Sudan, who are on a constant killing spree, and to Saudi Arabia, which is still bombing Yemen. And this is a direct responsibility. Canada, US, UK, France, other countries are still selling weapons to people who are committing war crimes. This is direct complicity. They need to be reminded. I don't think they forgot. I think they don't care. So it is about making it costly for them to do that. And I think as a humanitarian sector, the very people who are treating the injuries and feeding the hungry, who are destitute by these conflicts, there is a value in taking us an unequivocal stand. I would argue part of the fundamental role of humanitarians is not to just play the system to the best possible, is to actually put effort into moving the needle of justice in the right direction in the system. It needs a real reform. It needs a reform that actually doesn't care to keep the form of the system as it is. It just needs it to function. And that might change how it looks like. It might change some of the fundamental things. I think it's worth mentioning, for example, that Save the Children, I believe, has pulled recently from the pooled funding and country level. It's been argued for years that the pooled funding should be mostly directed as local organizations, but a lot of INGOs sat there and benefited from it. And under the current circumstances, it's harmful to local organizations that INGOs get money out of it. So instead of arguing it endlessly, which has been the case, Save the Children pulled out. Now, I don't want to assume that I know what's in the heads and hearts of the leaderships of Save the Children, but this seems like a well-motivated and actually pretty good move. Create the example where I'm willing to sacrifice some of my resources so I can right what is wrong, rather than just talk about it endlessly. I hope this was done with the best intentions and it leads in the right direction. But the intention matters. And I think it is the intention now, more and more, as the system breaks down, to not only survive, hopefully, but to actually be part of building the future of this system.
Now, the next thing I want to talk about is messaging. One of my favorite episodes we did was on whether the aid sector has a marketing problem, because it's something that's been on my mind for a very long time. And I think I just like to see humanitarians squirm at the mention of anything being called marketing. But failures in messaging also came up in terms of coalition building to fight things like the backsliding of gender equality. What can people do to fix some of these narrative issues?
As humanitarians, we need to talk more about the people we serve, independent of us. I think it was in the conversation I had with Tom Fletcher as well. He said people are protesting for Palestine, implying that it's a good thing. He said, I don't see people protesting against aid cuts.
They're not marching in the streets right now protesting about aid cuts. Where are the polls showing that 2/3 of people are angry that we spend 100 times more on defense than on humanitarian work? It's not happening. So somewhere along the way, we lost connection, sufficient connection with that group. Now, maybe they've just gone quiet, they're a bit distracted, a bit anxious, and they'll come back. But I do think somewhere along the way, we sort of made it sound as though this was brain science, what we're doing, as opposed to a basic human instinct to be humanitarians.
And it hit me. It's true. People aren't protesting against aid cuts. Why would they? Aid is not a cause. People's lives is a cause. And no one protests to protect, a global conglomerate of large NGOs. People need a cause, and that illustrates itself. I don't think we've been able to present a unified cause and support it consistently of the unequivocal value of human life, and that people deserve to not be subjected to the conflicts and crises, and to point out the causes of those conflicts and crises. And again, if we go back to Palestine, it's staggering how many press releases talk about the people being killed as if they were killed by angels or demons or so on. It's how much we avoid naming the cause of the problem. Not the deep causes. I'm talking about the primary causes. Who shot the bullet that ended up in a child's head? But also the secondary causes. Why are there weapons to that extent? Why do we continue to accept taxpayer money going to bad causes? Who benefits of all this? I think there needs to be a consistency, an end goal. I mean, I find it easier to say, the climate activists, whether they're radical or reformist, whether they wear suits and go to the UN meeting or wear, black and go protest in the street, they can pitch their cause in 20 seconds. We are burning the planet. We really would like to not burn the planet so the next generations do not die in a hellhole. In humanitarianism, we have a simple message, but it doesn't link much in my mind. And that came after that discussion in the episode with Polly and Sana. Humanitarianism builds on all humans are equal, but we don't practice it as all humans are equal because we don't stand our ground when Sudan doesn't get aid, but Ukraine does. People deserve aid. We don't say what aid, what is the minimum that we can live with, and beyond that is act of harm. We don't have the ability to elaborate who's depriving people of this and how do we resist that deprivation that is happening. And it goes back to the loss of the political acumen of the system. Thing I was reminded of in the discussion with Saskia, we talk, for example, about providing abortion as a necessity, and it is a medical necessity, especially in places where the health system doesn't work. Termination of pregnancy provided by professional carers prevents women from seeking it in places that are unsafe. So many organizations talk about safe abortion and as a matter of health and survival. It is largely a matter of health and survival. But it is also a matter of sovereignty of women over their bodies. But they don't talk about that because they don't want to wade into the political part of it. I think we should wade into the political part of it. I think we should talk about, we're not doing this just to prevent infections and death. We're doing this because we believe, even in places affected by conflicts and oppression and so on, women should still have autonomy over their bodies and have the choice to. I mean, not everybody needs to believe that, but we have to have an institutional position. If we believe that it is important, we need to believe it for all the good reasons, not only some of them. You can't choose convenience over conviction all the time. The other thing is, in that episode with Sana and Polly, you went to the street, Levi, and asked people about what humanitarian, and the answers weren't very encouraging. Mm-hmm. A lot of people didn't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Where I spoke to people most was in Washington Square Park, which is right by the NYU campus. And look, this was a small sample set in New York City, but it is a park that brings all kinds of people together. So, of course, I found NYU students, but also elderly people eating lunch in the park. There are performers. It's a lot of people. And yeah, it was shocking to me how the amount of people that couldn't even really conceptualize humanitarianism or a humanitarian was pretty wild. And then on top of that, the major question is, does humanitarianism have a marketing problem? I think when people can't even define the key terms, I would say that leans towards a yes. And yeah, once we dug into what these things are, the consensus was, yeah. Once again, I think a lot of opaqueness, but I think not a lot of opaqueness on purpose, but just that the word isn't getting out. There's not enough good storytelling, I think.
Yes.
When USAID was cut, I mean, the proper messaging would have been, this is what happens. This is why you should care. I think people just didn't really know. The message wasn't offered to them in a way that really engaged them. And in a time where attention is a very valuable commodity and very sparse,
yeah,
you have to get the messaging down.
You could watch a movie, a historical fiction movie about some people suffered something hundreds of years ago, or Star Wars, and feel empathy for, the rebellion and hatred for the empire. But you can't muster that in people now. It's fascinating.
I mean, so many of the stories on the new Humanitarian, they would make great blockbuster films.
Yes.
It's conflict, it's drugs, it's famine. All these things are incredibly interesting and should, at face value, evoke a lot of empathy.
They affect people. that we can identify with, people that exist now and here, not fictional characters, not historical characters.
Yeah.
And it tells you something, the inability to empathize with people who are affected. We fail to talk about them or to treat them as equals, as part of our common humanity. And that's not intentional. I'm not saying people are horrible and they do humanize others. Susan Sontag wrote a pamphlet called Regarding the Pain of Others. Part of what she talked is observing others in pain without being able to act upon it creates this empathy fatigue. I'm horribly paraphrasing her. She's an amazing writer. And we are trying to communicate a story without communicating action except give us money so we can help them. But this is way too many degrees separate.
Right.
Even write your congressman, it's not real action. We need to provide the connection beyond just hopefully decreasing poverty porn of showing starving kids, or heroic stories of how we did amazingly well, or self-advertisement and give us money. The storytelling needs to be authentic, real, connected. And for that, as much as I appreciate and admire the Combs people, they are being directed to serve the purposes of the organization rather than the purposes of the people they serve. And I think we really need authentic storytelling here. We really need to carry and amplify the voice and intention of people we serve rather than how we see them or how we would describe them. It's a long journey, even for us. We publish in English only, which is a very narrow audience. A lot of the people we write about cannot read our stories, and this is a deficiency that we need to overcome. But we need to have the intention, and that needs to be honest and selfless, because you cannot really tell a good story for personal interest. It needs to be paramount. It needs to be the center of your desire to actually tell the story rather than benefit from it. It should be on the top of our mind all the time.
And something that I see a lot of, and I think it's part of an issue with an echo chamber, but I do think a lot of the aid sector messaging is, well, you should care because you should care. It's sort of like, obviously you should care about other people in need. And it's imposing an ethics as opposed to making the case for.
Yes.
And I feel like, yes, I would love to live in a world where that's everyone's ethics. They just read a line that X amount of people died in a preventable famine or something like that, and they would care. But like, that's not the world we live in. You got to make a case for why people need to care.
I mean, we deal with it in a deontological Kantian way. You shouldn't lie because lying is always wrong and absolutely impossible. This is the ethics. Live with it.
Right.
I don't necessarily identify with the utilitarian school, but Peter Singer puts it very well in explaining why we should be caring about people on the other side of the planet. He goes a step further. In the 70s, he wrote a book called Animal Liberation. And he talks about why we should care about animals. And he puts it in a way that is indisputably, painfully obvious, as in, why do we eat animals? Why do we kill animals? Well, because they don't feel pain. So if someone is in a coma and doesn't feel pain, can we eat them? No, because they have no consciousness. And what he demonstrates is we draw an absolute hard line between what we consider human and inhuman. And here in empathy, we draw, intentionally or not, an absolute hard line between what we consider like us and not like us. And it came across in a blunt way when the Russian invasion of Ukraine came. Some of the journalists on live TV went and said, but those refugees are like us. And by like us, they meant white.
Right.
So they're not, Afghanis or Syrians or Iraqis or, Senegalis or so on. And that tells you something. But we should have evolved beyond that.
We at least have to address it and try to create messaging to evoke the same kind of feeling.
And there's a moral hazard in you should care because you should care. Because the implication is if you don't immediately care the exact way I tell you to care, you're a lesser person, morally lesser person. And that doesn't really bring people together, does it?
No, it is also very, as you were saying before, paternalistic.
It is. My understanding is undisputable, and you should buy into it without argument or discussion. You should care now.
Mm-hmm.
That failure of marketing, I know you're trying to tease people, but it tells me something. It might, again, not be a failure of marketing unless we identify what are we selling to whom.
Mm-hmm.
If we are selling services and survival, or providing as a product services and survival to people who are affected, then yes, there is a failure. But if we are providing absolution to donors, then it's working fine.
Right.
So it is important to look internally and figure what's the political economy of our marketing messages. Who
Mhm.
are we marketing it to? Because until last year, it was marketed fairly well to donors. Not anymore.
No.
It's also marketing to whom and what messages and towards what end is important. We cannot just skim through that without critically assessing it.
And the last thing I want to bring up in terms of messaging is also something that Saskia Brechenmacher brings up as one of the big takeaways for battling the backsliding in gender equality, and that is hammering home greater coalition building. And in topics of gender equality, there is very little messaging that includes men in that.
Yes.
And look, men in general get a lot of attention in lots of different topics, but you can't just ignore them in this topic.
One additional strategy I'd like to mention is also kind of focusing on bringing in men and boys into these conversations. I talked earlier about the drivers of all of this, and I mentioned that one important driver is kind of a sense of status loss and threat among some men, particularly young men, in places that feel like a loss of identity and a loss of social purpose, and that manifests itself in multiple ways, including in some cases in a rise in sort of anti-feminist sentiments. And I think that's obviously a very complicated phenomenon, but I think what it signals to me is really the importance of including men in the conversation around gender equality. Over the past decades, that's really been driven by concern for women's rights, right? And women's status in society. And I think that's essential. You know, when we're talking about gender equality and gender, we're also talking about the rights and flourishing and well-being of men and boys.
And I think there's a delicate balance to be achieved. Some will tell you it's not my job to educate you. You go and educate yourself, very rightly. And others spent an inordinate amount of time educating me. But we need to read the room and be useful.
Yeah.
And I think that is, as humanitarians, is as relevant as it is in our own societies.
Yeah, and that's, I think, also utilizing men to build coalition with other men for the cause. And it's then the inclusion of men and then the utilizing of and then the messaging outward for things like this needs to be revamped, because at the moment there is just a massive amount for various reasons, and everybody should listen to this episode. Saskia really breaks down the various factors in why so many men are feeling lost and disaffected, and then also contributing to backsliding in gender equality. And we need to do something about it. And it starts with the messaging. We need to get these people on our sides, and we need to convince them. Same point. You can't just say you should care because you should care.
Yeah.
That doesn't cut it. People need to be convinced. And finally, the last category I want to talk about is aid cuts. Obviously, a lot of people in the aid sector were majorly concerned about this because it, of course, affects their livelihoods, i.e., will I have a job? Will headquarters move? Will my project lose funding? What I think is interesting is that, of course, many people on the ground were deeply affected by the cuts, but for some, there was also this sense that things have been critically underfunded for so long, and more of a focus on how we can move away from this broken system. And, of course, when we speak about a broken system, it inevitably circles back to liberalism. And that's something you brought up in the episode with Mark Goldberg and Anjali Dayal. When we were speaking about the aid cuts, you said something along the lines of it not being a crisis of funding, but more of a crisis of liberalism.
What is happening is not a lack of money that is causing difficulty for the aid system. What is happening is the lack of will, if you want, the shift of politics away from politics of solidarity. And this is where the idea of illiberalism comes. Cuts have been happening for a long time, and Europeans are implicated in them quite aggressively. We have published quite detailed accounts of how much cuts have happened in the past 10 years. Not only cuts straightforward, but rechanneling what is called aid to become what is called security or stabilization. So this is one context. And then the vulgarity of the way the cuts were done by the US administration provided cover for even further cuts by other countries. And that was conflated with talks about, the need for more armament, more defense. And the aid cuts are an indication of the decay of politics without having an alternative. As of 2 days ago, the US abducted, kidnapped, and here I'm being very specific with words because the whole media globally decided to call it captured, kidnapped a sitting president. If we talk about liberal system, one of the main tenets of it is sovereignty of states. And despite all the excuses, you don't get to decide that someone is illegitimate and then proceed to kidnap them. Una Hathaway, who we interviewed in December about international law, was quoted saying that if this is the standard, then anyone doing anything is fine. I'm paraphrasing, but it's clearly a crisis of liberalism. International humanitarian law is the canary in the mine. If you want a proof that there's no liberal world order anymore, look no further than a head of state like Netanyahu having an ICC arrest warrant and flying over European skies to go to the US and be hosted like a head of state, and the kidnapping of another head of state. How do you govern humanitarianism whose donors are the same ones who are creating the humanitarian crisis so blatantly? And I don't want to jump the gun because we still don't know enough, but there are many questions to ask of UNOCHA. After all the cuts, they've just received a $2 billion donation from the US. The US is cutting funding from WHO, UNICEF, WFP, UNHCR, and they've decided to give $2 billion to OCHA. I mean, this is a lifeline for OCHA because, OCHA was about to lose a lot of staff and funding. But it's much less than the US used to give for humanitarian aid before. And I am happy in principle that it's going to the pooled funding at the country level. But there are big questions. What are the conditions that come with it? We know some of the conditions. Yemen and Afghanistan and potentially Palestine are not included in the 17 countries that are deemed a priority. What are the other conditions? What are the concessions that were made for this money to be given? This needs to be transparent. And those are legitimate questions that we need to know because this is both taxpayer money of American taxpayers and potentially a cover for the Trump administration, because then the UN will start going out as, thanking the benevolence of the Trump administration. Here's the test. When liberalism fails, it strips people of the masks of benevolence. And if you look at European leaders now, they're twisting themselves into knots. And if chaos is allowed to prevail when it's suitable for them, they really cannot prevent it when it's unsuitable for them.
With that, I'd like to home in on the things that our guests have said in terms of the way they're thinking about navigating this new landscape. Although, as we've said, there's been aid cuts for a very long time, and folks have been navigating things like this for a very long time. What sort of tools, systems, structures that we heard about maybe give you a little bit of hope that things will be built in a better way from this? You know, flowers grow best in shit, they say.
The positive part is like Faiza told us.
This is not just a question of charity. This is a question of justice. It's a question of what's owed. And I'm not talking about historical debt and, centuries of exploitation. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the climate debt that rich, polluting countries are liable to pay low and lower middle income countries. That by far exceeds anything they pay in humanitarian aid or overseas development assistance. And so I think it's not a charity, it's a fraction of what's owed.
Like Hourie told us.
And I felt with the funding cuts, it's started to be the case more and expected from local organizations to do very much with very little, just because we're saying that local organizations are efficient. And this is not what we mean when we say local organization is efficient. There is an efficiency argument there for sure, but that does not mean they can do miracles with the cheap labor and expect them to deliver. And we cannot also expect them to deliver overnight. Local actors cannot do miracles and do not expect to get out today and them taking the role tomorrow without actually working with them on some transitional period.
There has always been humanitarianism that is not part of the system. I was talking to friends who know Iran very well. And, what you might see on the news now, even though it's not covered much, is that there have been protests against the Iranian government and the Iranian regime, and a lot of people were assaulted and killed. But now, and during the 12 Days War in Iran, when Israel attacked Iran, there has been an immediate emergence of extremely local humanitarian efforts by communities to help each other. This has always been the case. It's not a surprise. This is how human communities work. And my hope is if we lose the superstructure of the humanitarian system, or if it becomes too beholden to power, or if it becomes incapable of fulfilling its promises, we still have roots enough people who believe in solidarity, who are able to connect, who are able to act in a humanitarian manner without needing a humanitarian cover.
So my final question is for us to look forward. And I want you to talk a little bit about what we have in store for 2026 and what are some of the North Stars guiding our coverage.
I think one of the things that we're working on is historicizing some of the humanitarian trends that we see now. And I'm really excited about that because the people we are selecting are incredibly knowledgeable and capable and would be brilliant to listen to. I think we are in a crisis of information and knowledge. I've written something on LinkedIn about this bad coverage of Venezuela by many Western outlets. And someone challenged me, is everybody bad except the new humanitarian? And I was about to get defensive and so on. And then I thought, you know what? That's not an appropriate way to put it. But we have one of the few places where the expression I've learned from journalists since I joined is you report without fear or favor. Andrew, our head of editorial, repeats it all the time. And it's one of the few places where we are still able to report without fear or favor. And I think in the middle of an onslaught of bad information and control and cuts and so on, to still be able to do that is something to be proud of. And we have provided vigorous critique of the humanitarian system over the past period. And I know that a lot of people think that some of it, at least, is gratuitously being critical. I will correct the record. I think a lot of the system is problematic and is making wrong choices. But I do think most of the people who work in it are actually quite sincere and capable and have their hearts in the right place. Now, look, you need everybody. You need people whose job is to keep things going, even if they're not perfect. And you need people to be critical about things, even if they are nearly perfect. And I think every voice is needed. And we are particularly privileged to be in a place where we can speak our mind and suffer no consequences.
It's a privilege, and it's also a responsibility.
Yes, we have to speak our minds, because there are way too many people who cannot afford to speak their minds or pay incredible prices for doing that.
I, for one, look forward to continuing to pick apart these systems and be extra critical. Tammam, thank you so much for joining us on your podcast.
Thank you for letting me ramble, which I don't get to do enough, apparently. Thank you for listening to Rethinking Humanitarianism. Our show is produced, edited, and mixed by Levi Sharpe. Editorial oversight provided by Erwin Loy. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. Please rate and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider becoming a member of The New Humanitarian to help us continue reporting from the heart of crises. Go to www.thenewhumanitarian.org to find out more.